we're very lucky here to have with us Mr. Justin Murphy, who I like to describe as a persecuted public intellectual. Justin himself rejects this description. He says this is not how he thinks of himself. Of course, what difference does it make how one thinks of oneself in this age of witch hunts and persecutions and so forth and so on. So anyway, here we are, and I think that I don't know if I want to sort of say anything specific about the kind of space that this is, except maybe to say that this is almost literally a safe space, and that in fact you should all feel free to say whatever you want. And I think that what we're sort of trying to do somehow, sort of slightly Soledano style in this sort of kitchen here, is to actually be able to have discussions about whatever people want to discuss. And so we're very lucky to have Mr. Murphy, Dr. Murphy, I'm sorry.
No, they can't take that away from me. Can't take that away from me.
So Dr. Murphy.
He's not even a man anymore.
Cool. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming here tonight to hang out. Really appreciate it. I appreciate your interest in whatever I have to say. And big thanks to Nina and to DC for inviting me out. Also, big thanks to Hector for letting us use your home. This is an amazing space. It's awesome doing things doing events like this in people's homes is always really nice. So very grateful. So yeah, big thanks to everyone. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is honesty. And I'm going to try to make the case that honesty is, I'm going to try to use it as a technical term. I'm going to actually try to make the case that honesty is actually a very particular kind of political operation. There's a mechanism involved. There's a certain philosophical and sophisticated way of understanding honesty as a particular kind of political practice that has been understood actually throughout the history of Western thought. It's actually been a recurring idea. And I want to first, the first thing I'm going to try to achieve, and I don't have too long, so I'm going to have to kind of do some hand waving here and there, so not everything will be fully spelled out. But the first thing I'd like to do is explain what I mean by honesty. I've written a lot with this, I've used this term a lot in some of my writings and some of the things I've been saying lately. So I want to kind of back that out a little bit more, with a little bit more sophistication, and tell you what I mean by that. Then what I want to try to do is tell an empirical story about kind of the 20th century history into 21st century history. And there's a story I've been telling, which I'd like to kind of synthesize for you. I've been telling it in different ways, in fragmentary ways on my blog and things like that. But I want to take this opportunity to kind of synthesize it and tell it in one kind of coherent narrative. And it has to do with basically what I would call sort of the changing opportunity structure, to use a word from political science, for honesty. Basically technology, and in particular media technology, has obviously changed tremendously, in the modern period, obviously throughout the modern period, but there's a particular kind of evolution in the media technological landscape that you see through the 21st century, through the 20th century into the 21st century. And I think we're really right now at a really interesting and exciting kind of inflection point, that I think remains poorly understood still. So I have a kind of empirical historical story that I'm going to kind of sketch out for you. And basically what that comes down to is I'm going to try to convince you that actually right now I think, the prospects for radical honesty as a specific kind of, radical, I even dare say revolutionary kind of political operation that has always existed, and it's always kind of functioned with certain recurring features, almost law-like features, is now becoming more and more viable. The incentives for it are actually increasing, and the costs for executing it are actually decreasing. So that's the case I'm going to try to make to you tonight. So I'm just going to kind of go in that order. So when I use this word honesty a lot, and it sounds kind of quaint. It sounds almost kind of corny when you just talk about being honest. It sounds like, just speak from the heart, and these kinds of cliches are what come to mind. But in fact, running throughout the history of Western political thought and practice even, there's actually been a fairly coherent and sophisticated notion of radical honesty as a fundamental kind of political procedure. So in the Greek, we have this term, which gets transliterated as Parrhesia. And it's translated in many different ways. This is an ancient Greek term. Foucault writes about it at length in his final lectures, there's a book that compiles the lectures called The Courage of Truth. So I think it's basically, I think, the best title by Foucault that you can find. Really, really rich stuff, where he basically talks about this practice of Parrhesia and the way that it functioned in the ancient world. in particular. The ancient Cynics were especially known for it. So Diogenes of Sinope, for instance, is a major signpost. Diogenes of Sinope was an ancient Greek philosopher, but he's not at all what any of us would think of when we think of philosophers. He basically lived out of a barrel. He was basically a homeless man. He would go around kind of barking at people, literally barking. He was well read and had sophisticated ideas, but basically it was a kind of really radical, militant way of a lifestyle of basically speaking truths to power. He had almost no belongings. He was rude to everyone. A famous anecdote that really gives you a sense of what we're talking about. And he's a Parrhesiast, right? So I'm giving you an example of ancient Parrhesia, or radical kind of honesty, radical truth speaking. This term Parrhesia, which I'm trying to back out for you, to give you a kind of emblematic example of the kinds of things that Diogenes was known for as a Parrhesiast. Something like, he once was giving a speech at, the Isthmian Games, which is kind of like something like, think like the Olympics, like a kind of, competitive, a series of contests. He was giving a speech to a crowd there, and at the end of his speech, he shit all over the stage, like, lifted up his toga or whatever, and just shat all over the stage. Obviously, no, I'm afraid I don't have what it takes. I'm not as, radical a Parrhesiast as he is. Yes. Right. So, from the outside, you look at this and you're like, first of all, how is that philosophy? What is the meaning of this? It's just kind of crazy, right? Obviously, he was hated by most people. He was a gadfly of the worst variety. It's very annoying. It seems very trivial. What's interesting or significant about this? You might also be thinking, how is that honesty? It's not even, it doesn't map onto what we think of as honesty. But this is an example of what we'd call, of what the ancient world knew as Parrhesia. And Parrhesia is, another way, it's sometimes translated as frank speech is one way to put it. But the phrase that I really like that's used to kind of summarize it is saying it all or saying everything. So it's not just like saying what you think or feel, honestly. It's performing in a kind of excessive way the truth of what you are. So for instance, like shitting on a stage is an example of it because, humans shit, right? It's something that on a daily basis in kind of bourgeois society, we all pretend that we don't shit. It's something we hide, right? That's a kind of lying, right? And so the Parrhesiast is he or she who embarks on a kind of lifestyle, a whole lifestyle of basically exposing and revealing, everything, the entire range of everything, basically, saying it all. Okay, so that's this idea in ancient Greece. And, you see this also with Christ, and this basically becomes a kind of touchstone for Christianity, although it gets obviously, very, increasingly sophisticated and kind of sublimated, if you will. But Christ, some of you know the famous anecdote from, Mark, I think it is, when, Peter tries to say to Christ, hey, don't preach your message so publicly. The Roman authorities are gonna, they're gonna do you in, you're gonna be crucified or whatever. Don't be so rash about it. And Christ responds, specifically invoking, or I think it was Peter who invoked the word Parrhesia. So he's basically saying, don't be a Parrhesiast. You can preach your truth, say your things, but you don't have to go above and beyond in a way that's gonna piss off the authorities and it's gonna get you killed. All right. So, they use specifically that same word, Parrhesia, right? Okay, so I'm just kind of sketching for you the kind of ancient antecedents for this, and it runs all the way up through. I would argue you see it even in like the better strands of radical feminism, like the good insights that are to be found in contemporary feminism, like such as consciousness raising. There's this kind of rediscovery that in fact, like when you get into small groups and you allow people to be radically honest and share it all. Fundamentally positive and transformative things do occur. It's a mechanism, and it's a reliable one that works. So that's when I say honesty, this is what I'm referring to. This kind of ancient practice of Parrhesia, which involves a kind of excessive just laying bare. It's not something fancy. It's not like revealing the truths of scientific truths or philosophical truths that are particularly impressive or sophisticated. It's a lifestyle of just not hiding things, not sugarcoating things, and being kind of as excessively sort of revealing or unconcealing as possible. And so Foucault analyzes this and really kind of shows how it's a very particular political practice. And in fact, he argues that it's actually a recurring mode of revolutionary politics. It's a way of being revolutionarily militant. And it has a particular logic in which it actually really, I would argue that Parrhesia is perhaps the only known method we have in terms of a concrete technique that we know that is demonstrably effective for kind of transforming the social fabric. In short, it's a genuinely radical or revolutionary political tactic where individuals and groups can actually follow certain principles and transform society at large in a way that maps onto what most of us think of as like revolutionary politics, like trying to change the world, trying to change society. We don't actually know how to do that very well, as the history of radical movements shows. But I would argue that this is one specific and kind of demonstrable technique that has that effect. And in ancient cynicism, that effect is kind of described as defacing the currency. This is a phrase that Diogenes was famous for. This idea, because so this is the basic logic, and then I'm going to move on to the kind of empirical story. I've been told I have about 20 minutes, so I don't want to abuse that.
Yeah, no, it's
Okay, cool. So the idea is that this is a real mechanism because it quote unquote defaces the currency. And basically what that means is that look, all of, bourgeois society is based on lies, right? It's actually a kind of foundational component of modern society that we become civilized. Manners, what we call manners, right? Like functioning and in a modern society basically is defined by this division between the front stage and the backstage. We have our public selves, and then we have all of the things we think and feel and do on a daily basis that are hidden, right? So living in public in a modern bourgeois society is systematically lying all the time in some basic sense. We've so naturalized it that we don't even see it as lying, but that is basically what it is. Because that is why such kind of like stupid and idiotic, hysterical, nonsense can kind of proliferate. Whether it be like modern bureaucracy, like the idiocy, just the sheer patent nonsense that you get at like the average bureaucratic workplace today. The directives that literally make no sense. It's just a proliferation, a kind of growth or multiplication of just sheer nonsense, like, and basically, lies and misdirections. That is because in some sense, modern society is itself structured foundationally on the split between the front stage and the backstage. Okay. This idea of defacing the currency, the reason it's a serious and sophisticated kind of political operation. Radical honesty is a political operation is because what it basically does is when someone uses their life to basically not just say something that's true, but to live in a way that is fundamentally, excessive. It's constantly kind of showing all the things that are hidden, right? It has the effect of devaluing all of the things that people pretend to value, like, all of the bullshit, basically, all the fake values, get devalued. They get revealed as counterfeit, Foucault says. They get shown to be the false coin that they really are. And the Parrhesia in their excess, shows basically, that there is another kind of life that is possible. The other life, which is the true life, Foucault says. The Parrhesia kind of reveals that and makes it palpable. It makes it attractive and visible and kind of irresistible in a way. And it constitutes its own kind of power. It often also tends to generate its own community around that kind of radical, Parrhesiastical kind of excessive lifestyle. It tends to generate its own independent, authentic, kind of organic community that potentially can be more truthful I would say, to use a word from kind of the radical left tradition, I would say, emancipated or liberatory kind of community, kind of naturally emerges in the embodiment of this kind of like radical Parrhesiastic act. Okay, so that's just a summary of this idea of Parrhesia or radical honesty, I like to say, as a political mechanism that has been with us throughout the history of Western civilization and often quite explicitly understood in the times and places in which it arises. Although, of course, it's always, it's always a kind of fringe, underground kind of current. Obviously with Christianity, it kind of explodes in this kind of, extraordinary movement. But yeah, so that's what I mean by honesty. And I would argue that it works. It really does work. It is actually a way for people to explode kind of like the bullshit, right? In a way that is fundamentally productive and effective. And it actually does change the way that the people around you are able to see themselves and they're able to behave, and it opens that up. And I would say that that's basically my model of revolutionary politics. I'm still, people, like, we were joking today about how, like, sometimes people call me, like, I'm alt-right or something like that. But I still see everything I'm saying right now as basically in a kind of revolutionary left-wing tradition, personally. I see this as about emancipation and trying to figure out ways for individuals and small groups to think and speak and act in a way that maximizes, creative, human flourishing, right? So that's how I see it. So, okay, so that's this concept of Parrhesia, right? Now, okay. Obviously, any political technique can be made more or less available. It can be the probabilities of it succeeding or the probabilities of it being suppressed can increase or decrease depending on different background variables, right? And so I think that basically what happened in the 20th century with the rise of mass broadcast technology in particular, so like think beginning around the 1920s is when radio really becomes a kind of significant force in kind of advanced liberal democracies such as the US or whatever the case might be. From around the rise of radio in the 1920s all the way up until the TV era, and it really doesn't start to kind of recede, this period I'm describing in the 20th century, until around the 1970s with cable is when you have a kind of the beginning of a transition to where we are now. But from about the 1920s to about the 1970s is this kind of golden age of mass broadcast technology, radio, TV, primarily. And this was basically, the contention I'm going to put to you is that this was basically a catastrophe for truth-telling and for prospects of Parrhesia as a political kind of feature of life today. And the reason is, I think, pretty easy to see. It's because if your message wants to kind of, if you want to have any kind of reach for your message, you have to kind of play the game of getting on TV or getting on radio. So these are one-to-many broadcast technologies where, like, it's not networked, it's not the internet. It's like, if you are the person with the radio microphone or the TV microphone, you get your message put into the ears of mad people, like millions of people, right? Who are more or less a captive audience because they don't have that much choice, right? This is really, really bad for truth telling because what it basically means is that there's a lot of incentives to lie, to fib, to kind of, neuter your thoughts and your expression to get that top spot on the TV or whatever it might be. And if you don't submit to that sterilization and that kind of fibbing and lying that involves, then your message just doesn't go anywhere, right? So I would argue this has been a really, really, catastrophic, experience for the human species in terms of its, like, truth-telling capacities, this mass broadcast area. So I like to think of it as, like, just to fix ideas in your minds in a simple way. Basically, the structure of the communication, the communication structure from the 1920s to the 1970s in America, the UK, whatever it might be, is basically like it's one big pyramid, right? And it's like, if you get to the top of that pyramid, your message gets out to all the people at the bottom of the pyramid. So that's just to fix the ideas. And what happens with it begins with cable, and then it accelerates into, the internet age that we're now living through, is the fragmentation of the communication structure. I think that's fairly intuitive to understand, right? What cable represents, so this is like when CNN appears, when Fox News appears, it's an increase in choice. All of a sudden, media choice starts to open up. And that's when you start to see basically people realize, okay, I don't need to, play this game of, like, the mega mass pyramid. I can just, if I'm Rush Limbaugh, I can just make my own radio station. Or if I'm, whatever the case might be, I can just make my own little independent pyramid and say my truth that way and get all my people under that pyramid. And basically what you're seeing ever since the 1970s to today is this process of fragmentation has been accelerating. We as humans take a long time to kind of update our intuitions about the world that we live in. Most of us today, we're kind of, we came up at a time when some kind of, like, mass broadcast communication structure was just, we naturalized it. It's just how, communication politics takes place. But it's rapidly receding. And it's so rapidly receding that, in fact, what's really different now is that the gains from getting on TV, the gains from getting on, like, primetime radio or mainstream TV or whatever, the kind of political gains from that are rapidly approaching zero, it seems to me. And so this is someone who's kind of, over the past few months, I've kind of had my foot in independent media. And, I've been an academic, so I've been on TV and stuff. Like, I've done Al Jazeera and in the studio and all that kind of shit. And I've been struck as someone who's kind of has a foot in both worlds over the past few months. The effects, just the impacts, that come from doing, like, mainstream TV, it's almost nothing. I mean, that I can tell anyway. And, writing blog posts or making videos that even if only a few hundred people see them, like, people pay way more attention to that. They're way more, like, open to it and kind of, like, dynamically, responsive to it. And so this difference between the kind of big pyramid communication structure that we saw from the 1920s to the 1970s to this kind of rapidly accelerating proliferation of tiny pyramids, is a game changer, I would say, for the prospects of truth telling. And so my basic kind of, like, concluding line here, is that basically I think we're slow to update. We're slow to realize this, but basically all of the incentives for anyone who's interested in intellectual life today, if you're interested in, saying interesting, truths of any kind, and not even necessarily profound, but you're just interested even in just a simple, kind of more honest and direct, radically open and genuine way of thinking and expressing, those types of people and those types of practices are going to be increasingly rewarded right now and moving forward, because it's never been easier to kind of constitute your own Parrhesiastic community around that. And the gains from kind of playing the bullshit mainstream game seem to be rapidly decreasing because of this. And so that's why that's kind of my ultimate message here. And I know this kind of from experience. And I know I didn't talk much about my own case because I'm kind of tired of talking about myself. But if anyone's interested in, how I've kind of come to observe this and how this has happened in my own life, feel free to ask me any questions. But this is increasingly palpable to me. It's increasingly, I'm watching it not just introspectively in my own kind of experiments, but across the board of other people's also. And yeah, I think a lot of people have this idea that right now we're living in this like really repressive, politically correct age. And I think I obviously I see why people think that. But the power of those people to stop Parrhesiasts of all different variety, I think is rapidly decreasing. And the gains to just letting the hysterical, politically correct people, just letting them say whatever the fuck they want about you. Just let them. It doesn't matter. But say what you want to say. Do whatever you want to do. And if you're doing it authentically and really genuinely, and you don't look back, the opportunities to basically constitute an entire kind of world around that and to generate new communities, and then other people generate their own communities in this way, and for those to have free, authentic interchange and dynamic kind of political growth and energy, it's never been more ripe for that. And so that's kind of my message. I actually don't think we're living in a moment of severe political repression. I think it kind of looks and feels like that over the past few years, but that's only because we haven't really updated our intuitions about the actual incentive structures that are at play. And I think once people start to see this, it's going to be off to the races, and we're going to be living in boom times for Parrhesia is what I think is happening. So I think I should cut myself off there.
That's great.
Yeah.